Hello and welcome back to The World This Week with me, Jonathan Steele. Africa is losing more than it gains from its rich natural resources. That's according to a new report released by the Africa Progress Panel, a group of 10 prominent public figures, including Kofi Annan and Bob Geldof, which campaigns on African development issues. The panel says more must be done to ensure that countries which suffer from great poverty start to see the benefit of their natural resources. Let's take a look at this report.
19,500,000. 20 million for you, David. Sold to you, Raul, 23 million. Paddle 9107. Thank you very much.
23 million Swiss francs. That's 26.7 million US dollars for this diamond, which was sold at an auction in Geneva on Wednesday. The eye-wateringly high-winning bid, made by luxury jeweller Harry Winston, was a world record for a stone of this kind. Like many diamonds, it came from Africa, a continent rich in natural resources, but where mineral wealth often fails to translate into prosperity for ordinary citizens. Botswana, where the record-breaking diamond was found, is one of the few countries on the continent where the government is succeeding in ensuring profits from mineral exports are reinvested in the country. In a report released by the Africa Progress Panel this week, Botswana was marked out as an exception to the overall pattern, one of oil, gas and mineral wealth seeping out of Africa through tax avoidance, corruption and weak governance. The problem is so bad that Africa is losing twice as much in illicit financial outflows as it receives in international aid, according to the panel, which is chaired by former UN chief Kofi Annan. Here in South Africa, platinum mine workers were on strike again this week after a union member was killed. The action sparked fears of a return to last year's unrest, when 34 striking mine workers were shot dead by police. The situation here is in many ways emblematic of the report's findings. Despite producing 3/4 of the world's platinum, many of South Africa's mine workers still live in poverty, receiving wages too low to meet their basic housing, health and nutritional needs. Unfair tax regimes are one way big business is cashing in and ordinary workers are losing out in Africa. The Africa Progress Report quotes a study claiming that in Zambia, between 2005 and 2009, 500,000 mining employees were paying more tax than the mining companies themselves. Another example given is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which lost over $1.3 billion between 2010 and 2012 through undervaluation of assets and sale to foreign investors. That's twice the country's annual health and education budgets put together. The report says African governments, multinational corporations and the international community all have a role to play in making sure the benefits of natural resources stay local. But the companies operating in Africa insist that their investment in its resources is creating shared, sustainable growth, and some worry that more regulation might scare off investors. They may face a battle, however, with workers like these, for whom business as usual has become hard to bear. Emily Churchill, Islam Channel.
Well, with me in the studio to discuss these crucial issues is James Schneider, editor of Think Africa Press, and Lawrence Cockcroft, co-founder and former chair of Transparency International, and author of Global Corruption, Money, Power and Ethics in the Modern World. Welcome to the programme. And joining us by phone from Lusaka, we have Joseph Simumba, an economist at the free market think tank Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research. Welcome to you too. Let me come to you first, James. Who's mainly responsible for this? Is it the corporations or is it African governments themselves?
It's both of those, and it's also an international tax regime. You can't look at the way in which money is able to be taken out of Africa simply by looking at just the regulations that the local government is putting into place, or the companies' strategies of maybe trying to get the best deal that they can get. But you also have to look at how is it that they are able to do this? How are these beneficial structures of ownership possible, whereby large amounts of money can be essentially just taken out of the country? So I think you have to look at all three levels.
I mean, but that is legal, what they're doing. There's also the issue of illegality and corruption. I mean, how big a share of this problem is to deal with corruption as opposed to just getting people to pay decent taxes?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at the corruption aspect of this. One is to ask the question whether or not something that is legal is necessarily uncorrupt. And if we take the issue of pricing of a given product, let's take a product such as timber being exported, say, from a country like Cameroon or Democratic Republic of Congo, that may be significantly underpriced in relation to the world price. Strictly speaking, that may not be a criminal act. Audit profession guidelines say that everything should be priced at arm's length as if it was sold on the world price. But we've yet to see really effective pressure within the international audit profession to ensure that that is really enacted. I think that's the first point. And the second point is that in some cases, we're talking about commodities which are moving from the illegal sector into the legal sector. So if you take a commodity like coltan from Eastern DRC, which for many years was a key ingredient in mobile phones, coltan has been mined by militia groups, controlled certainly corruptly, partly by local warlords, but also partly by generals from Rwanda and Uganda in the past who have been able to control this trade, sell the coltan through comptoirs in Kivu, which has then entered the international manufacturing trade through smelters in Kazakhstan, Germany, and the US before being sold on to companies like Nokia. But this isn't just such a specialist area as coltan, which of course is a huge issue in itself. But if I can just return to the issue of timber, actually the US Timber Association published a report themselves 3 years ago saying that 17% of timber imported into the US was from illegal sources. Obviously that wasn't all from Africa. But
what were they proposing to do about it?
Well, they were, as it were, confessing that this is one of that many of their sources were illegal, and then that fed into a discussion about certification and whether or not certified timber if that's a route, as certification has been applied to various other products like diamonds, as I'm sure we're going to discuss. So I'm just, in response to your question, saying that we have two issues here, really, well, many issues, but two principal issues, one of which is the issue of the price at which exports are made, and the second of which is the origin of the product themselves.
But James Schneider, I mean, on the price issue that Lawrence has just raised, can the governments do anything to sort of say to the corporations, you know, you're undervaluing these assets?
Well, they can, but it's particularly difficult. So recently there was a documentary on the BBC in the Why Poverty series about how Glencore was engaging in this kind of transfer pricing in Zambia. And the difficulty for a government like Zambia to deal with Glencore is that it is 10 times smaller as an economy. The whole of Zambia is 10 times smaller than Glencore is in terms of annual revenues. And so just to say that one government should be able to do it all themselves, they're not going to be able to. You know, large international companies will be able to have significantly more lawyers, accountants and so on than most African countries' treasuries will be able to put up themselves. So I think you need to start to see increased cooperation and solidarity between African countries working regionally for regional best practices.
Well, let me come to you, Joseph Simumba in Lusaka. James has just talked about your country. I mean, do you agree with that the Zambian government really is pretty powerless to do anything about this? Or what could they do? What should they do?
Thanks very much. Like mentioned about, the problem we have is does our government got sufficient capacity to audit some of these big mining firms? So, like he mentioned, it's true we have a lot of capacity constraints, and I think, like he's pointed out, the issue of Glencore through its subsidiary here in Zambia, Mopangi Command. So. Even that report actually it was not fully validated back home here simply because the arrangement by which that audit was done was through some help of the Norwegian embassy. Hello?
Yes. Have we lost you?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Unfortunately, the quality is not good at all. perhaps we can try and improve it during the course of the programme. Let me come back to you then, Lawrence. You touched on diamonds, and we saw at the beginning of that clip that's an extraordinary sale going on in Geneva. I mean, it's a huge issue, the whole diamond thing, and they're very easy to smuggle because they're so small and portable and all the rest of it. What has been done since these exposés have come through and the trial of people like of the Liberian leader?
Well, I think the diamond sector is an area where we've seen both enormous progress, but also the limits to progress. I think that the tremendous effort which went up into setting the Kimberley process, thanks to Global Witness and others, has been an amazing story in the sense that it's now recognized that traceability of diamonds to show that they're not sourced in conflict zones is feasible. On the other hand, it's also true that a lot of people have jumped on that bandwagon. And there's been an enormous controversy in Zimbabwe as to whether or not the mining in Inyanga in eastern Zimbabwe, which is really controlled by the army, is a legitimate operation. The government of Zimbabwe claims that this is a corporate activity, even if the company is dominated by forces from within the army. But of course, the controversy over this has led Global Witness, as the originator of the whole movement, which is a very substantial movement now, to formally withdraw. And in their view, the Kimberley process is now has to be regarded as rather suspect, even though there are about 30 countries which are technically members of it, and there are 40 companies that are in one way or another involved in it. So it's a huge process, but I think it's also shown the flaws in this kind of arrangement. So it's a step forward, but it's also a step backwards.
Joseph Simumba, I think you're still there with us in Lusaka. One of the points made by the Africa Progress panel was that Botswana is doing reasonably well. What's your explanation for Botswana doing much better in capturing the revenue from its own resources? Well, we seem to have lost Joseph Simumba, unfortunately. Well, let me ask the same question to you, or perhaps you can answer it without me repeating the question.
Why has Botswana done better?
Why has Botswana done better?
Botswana set up an agreement between the government and the main mining company, De Beers, very early on. So Botswana receives a much, and has historically received a much higher percentage of the profits and of the revenues generated from diamond sales, which they've been able to then put into diversifying the economy and also into social spending. So it's really just down to, well, not only, but a significant factor is just down to them getting some of the money and some of the benefit from the extraction directly, as opposed to benefits of some people might be employed, and that might generate a bit of tax revenue.
And is there also a corruption issue or less corruption in Botswana? Is that also part of the solution?
Well, I think Botswana is a case of a country which, right from independence under Seretse Khama, has had a rather good record on minimizing corruption. And of course, Botswana has been consistently the least corrupt country in Africa on Transparency International's annual Corruption Perception Index, and has more or less maintained that position. So I think we have to give credit to successive Botswana governments for that, as well as the arrangement which we've just been discussing, in which the government took a serious share through the vehicle of Debswana from independence in the very early 70s. So this has been Debswana's and Botswana is an exceptional story.
And what about the actual use of resources? Let's say the governments are actually capturing these resources. Are they spending them in a decent way? I mean, we hear about this increasing inequality in most of countries in Africa as well as in other parts of the world. I mean, what is being done to try and produce a more equitable benefit from these resources?
Well, if I may come in on that, I think we have here to pay our respects to Ngozi Ojiwala, the current Minister of Finance in Nigeria, who this is her second time in office, who has provided extraordinary leadership on this issue. And in the first period, the first time she was in office under President Obasanjo, she introduced a system whereby every local government authority in Nigeria, of which there are more than 700, received quarterly information on the amount of federal government revenues flowing to that LGA, as they're called. And it was possible for any citizen in that LGA to see exactly how much federal government money was coming in, and then to have a debate about what was being done with it. And I think it's fair to say that did improve matters. On the other hand, it's proved a tough fight. She wrote a book about this called Reforming the Unreformable, which was published about a year ago, in which she describes just how difficult it has been to make this whole exercise meaningful. So it's admirable. The whole program called Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, is now associated with something called EITI Plus, which is supposed to deal with exactly what you're talking about. Let us have not only an understanding about what companies are paying to the government and what the government claims to be receiving from companies, but also a statement about how that money is being spent. But it's a big project.
Joseph Simumba, I think we have got you back again. Is that right? Are you there?
Yeah, exactly. I'm here.
All right. I hope you can hear us. What would you say about Zambia's record in spending wisely or fairly, equitably, the revenues that it does get from copper and other issues?
Yeah. So, like I was saying at first when the line got cut, the biggest problem we have in Zambia regarding the mines, like getting taxes from there, collecting taxes from the mines, is mainly because we don't have sufficient capacity. As you know, most of these mines use very sophisticated accounting techniques and methods to declare their tax liabilities. And it's important that also our tax authorities have got the relevant expertise that can match like the level of sophistication that is in these mining companies. But unfortunately, that is not there right now. So this is something that government has been working on with the help of cooperating partners. Like, you know, the primary report, audit report that came through for Glencore was actually an initiative between the Zambian government and the Norwegian government, who are providing capacity building, who are actually assisting the country with various capacity building initiatives to try and strengthen.
Yes, I think, Joseph, we're having great difficulty hearing you. Your voice is coming across in a slightly distorted fashion. I think we'll have to turn to one of the speakers in the studio at the moment. But thank you very much for your contribution. Let me come back to you, James, if I may, on the sort of whole issue of the Washington consensus, neoliberal economics and so on. Has the tide finally turned now? Are Western governments beginning to recognize there has to be more regulation of corporations?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think something that's referenced in the report says that the IMF has been pushing in some countries for governments to raise taxes rather than lower taxes. Now, if the IMF is doing that, that really does demonstrate that whole period, the whole Washington consensus period, is really well and truly over. And now we're moving into something else. It remains to be seen who is controlling this change and what sort of policies and what kind of social frameworks are going to emerge. But actions like this report and the kind of growing weight of international civil society and also domestic civil society, I think, is pushing things in a positive direction.
I mean, of course, there are people on this panel which has made this report who are archetypes of the original Washington consensus.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the 10 on the report is former Treasury Secretary Rubin, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, who's sort of seen as the kind of apogee, him along with Hank Paulson, the kind of apogee of finance-driven Washington consensus deregulatory policies, which most people now think failed quite dramatically. And I think the fact that someone like him is on the panel, and he is saying, well, actually, no, we need significant change in tax secrecy, we need change in tax havens, we need change in regulation, we need to prevent transfer pricing, we need equitable growth, we need government spending. The report talks a lot about the ways of infrastructure, social infrastructure, how debt isn't a particularly large issue, how there shouldn't be necessarily that much saving for the future now because the current population needs to be invested in. I think this is, from some of the people on the report and what they have previously been, this is quite dramatic.
And what about the issues like health and education, where there was a time when the World Bank was wanting more, that people should pay for education, pay for schools and all the rest of it, rather than having the old free education of the past? Has that changed now?
I think that debate rolls on to some extent, and there are different approaches country by country. But of course, it is the case that actually people do pay for health services because there's so much corruption in health services. And there are many instances in which people will face a hospital situation or even accessing a doctor's surgery, which is supposed to be free for one reason or another, where they are obliged to pay. And for that reason, actually, mission-backed health services, which have always charged, are in many countries like Tanzania and Uganda often more popular than public services where the charge is completely irregular. But this is mixed up now with the whole debate about the Global Fund for Relief of AIDS and Malaria, because there have been a number of scandals associated with that. And so there's a lot of insecurity now about the ways in which you can regulate health expenditure. On the whole, I would say it's improving, but from the point of view of the consumer, there's still a long way to go.
Well, we're coming to the end of this, but I sort of detect from both of you that you're relatively optimistic, actually. I mean, you think things are slowly getting better. Is that fair? In a sort of 20 words, are things getting better?
Well, if we're talking about Africa as a whole, both corporate behavior, dealing with corruption and popular welfare, I would say marginally better, but not as much as the media hype would suggest.
What about you?
In terms of discourse, I think, yes, I agree with what Lawrence just said, but I think the fact that tax secrecy and tax havens are on the agenda at the G8 and the G20, I think the fact that the discourse is moving so much more towards questions of equity is in itself a good thing.
Well, thank you very much. Our time has run out, and we must always avoid media hype. That is the lesson. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for watching.